You believe you know who the real monsters were in World War II. You've been told a story, a simple story. Good versus evil, heroes versus villains. But what you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you understood about that war and about human nature itself. Everything you learned about World War II was a carefully constructed illusion, because the history books didn't tell you the whole truth. They told you a version, a sanitized version, a politically convenient version. They told you about Nazi atrocities, and they were real, horrifying, undeniable. But they didn't tell you about the other darkness, the one that was hidden, protected, erased from collective memory. They didn't tell you what the Soviet Union did, not just to enemies, but to its own allies, to civilians, to entire populations who believed they were being liberated. And the reason they didn't tell you isn't because it wasn't documented. It's because revealing it would have destroyed the narrative that shaped the entire post-war world. The Soviet Union wasn't just fighting Nazi Germany during World War II. It was conducting one of history's most systematic campaigns of mass violence, rape, torture, and erasure, and it did so with calculated precision while the world looked the other way. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history that was deliberately suppressed for over half a century. In August 1939, before World War II even began, Stalin signed a secret pact with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. You might know the public version, a non-aggression treaty between two enemies. But there was a secret protocol, a clause that divided Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia like businessmen dividing territory. And what followed was a joint invasion of Poland. Yes, you read that correctly. Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia invaded Poland together. They coordinated attacks. They held joint military parades celebrating their conquest. They murdered Polish officers and intellectuals side by side.
But here's what makes this psychologically devastating. The world watched and did nothing, because it was politically inconvenient to call out the Soviets when the West would later need them to fight Hitler. So the first mass atrocity was erased before the war truly began. To understand why the Soviet atrocities were so systematic, you need to understand a fundamental principle of authoritarian psychology: dehumanization as state policy. When a regime trains its population to see certain groups as subhuman, it doesn't just create soldiers who follow orders. It creates a collective moral vacuum where ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil without psychological resistance. Stalin's regime had spent decades conditioning Soviet citizens to view class enemies, political dissidents, and ethnic minorities as vermin to be exterminated. By the time World War II began, this psychological programming was complete. Soviet soldiers weren't just fighting Germans. They were carrying with them a worldview where human life had no inherent value unless it served the state. And when they entered occupied territories, they brought that worldview with them. The NKVD, Soviet secret police, followed directly behind advancing Red Army troops with execution lists. Not lists of Nazi collaborators, lists of intellectuals, teachers, priests, community leaders, anyone who might resist Soviet occupation. This is what psychologists call preemptive cleansing, eliminating potential opposition before it can even form. In the Katyn Forest in 1940, Soviet executioners murdered over 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and professionals. Shot them in the back of the head. Buried them in mass graves. For decades, the Soviet Union blamed this massacre on Nazi Germany, and the world believed them. because it was easier than confronting an uncomfortable truth. Our ally was a monster too. But the psychological technique behind Catton reveals something even darker. This wasn't random violence. But here's what makes this psychologically devastating. The world watched and did nothing, because it was politically inconvenient to call out the Soviets when the West would later need them to fight Hitler. So the first mass atrocity was erased before the war truly began. To understand why the Soviet atrocities were so systematic, you need to understand a fundamental principle of authoritarian psychology: dehumanization as state policy. When a regime trains its population to see certain groups as subhuman, it doesn't just create soldiers who follow orders. It creates a collective moral vacuum where ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil without psychological resistance. Stalin's regime had spent decades conditioning Soviet citizens to view class enemies, political dissidents, and ethnic minorities as vermin to be exterminated. By the time World War II began, this psychological programming was complete. Soviet soldiers weren't just fighting Germans. They were carrying with them a worldview where human life had no inherent value unless it served the state. And when they entered occupied territories, they brought that worldview with them. The NKVD, Soviet secret police, followed directly behind advancing Red Army troops with execution lists. Not lists of Nazi collaborators, lists of intellectuals, teachers, priests, community leaders, anyone who might resist Soviet occupation. This is what psychologists call preemptive cleansing, eliminating potential opposition before it can even form. In the Katyn Forest in 1940, Soviet executioners murdered over 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and professionals. Shot them in the back of the head. Buried them in mass graves. For decades, the Soviet Union blamed this massacre on Nazi Germany, and the world believed them, because it was easier than confronting an uncomfortable truth. Our ally was a monster too. But the psychological technique behind Catton reveals something even darker. This wasn't random violence.
Between 1944 and 1953, the Soviet Union forcibly deported entire ethnic populations, not thousands, millions. Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Balkars, Kalmyks, Karachais. Entire peoples loaded onto cattle cars and shipped to Central Asia and Siberia. The official Soviet justification? Collective punishment for alleged collaboration with Nazi Germany. The reality? Many of these deportations began before German forces even reached these territories. This wasn't about collaboration. It was about ethnic cleansing under the cover of war. Over a quarter of the Chechen population died during deportation, not in combat, from starvation, disease, and exposure during the journey and in exile. Children froze to death in unheated train cars. Elderly people were literally thrown from moving trains when they died. Families were separated with bureaucratic cruelty. This is the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt wrote about. Not dramatic villainy, just paperwork, logistics, transportation schedules for human cargo. And the psychological devastation didn't end with physical displacement. These peoples were erased from Soviet maps, their place names changed, their histories deleted from textbooks. It was cultural genocide executed with administrative efficiency. But here's the revelation that makes this story truly disturbing. The world knew. All Allied intelligence agencies documented Soviet atrocities throughout the war. The Polish government in exile in London screamed about Katyn. Refugees testified about mass deportations and executions. And Western governments? suppressed it all. Because admitting the truth would have complicated the war narrative. It would have undermined public support for the alliance with Stalin. It would have raised uncomfortable questions about what we were really fighting for. So a decision was made at the highest levels of British and American government. The Soviet atrocities would be classified, dismissed, or attributed to Nazi propaganda.
When the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, the world celebrated. And rightly so. The images of skeletal survivors were searing testimony to Nazi evil. But what the cameras didn't show was what happened after liberation. How Soviet troops looted the surrounding towns. How they raped Jewish survivors who had just been freed from concentration camps. How NKVD officers immediately began arresting and deporting people suspected of being politically unreliable. Liberation for many meant simply exchanging one form of terror for another. And the psychological operation that made this possible was brilliant in its simplicity. Control the narrative by controlling who gets to tell the story. The Soviets understood that history isn't written by the victors. It's written by whoever controls the archives. For 50 years after World War II, Soviet archives remained sealed. Documents about atrocities were classified. Witnesses were silenced. Researchers who asked questions disappeared. And in the West, Cold War politics meant that even after we stopped being allies with the Soviets, we couldn't fully confront what they'd done during the war, because doing so would mean admitting that we'd known, and we'd done nothing. This is perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of this story, the complicity of silence. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, archives began to open. Documents emerged, mass graves were discovered, and the world learned what had been hidden. But by then, most perpetrators were dead, most witnesses were dead, and the narrative had been set for 2 generations. You can't unlearn 50 years of curated history easily. Even today, many people react with disbelief when confronted with the scope of Soviet war crimes, because it contradicts what they learned in school, what they saw in movies, what they've always believed. This is cognitive dissonance on a civilizational scale. So what should you learn from this? That historical truth is always more complex than the stories we're told.
That every narrative serves someone's interest. That the line between hero and villain is often drawn by whoever wins the power to draw it. But more importantly, you should understand the psychological mechanism that makes mass atrocity possible. The ability of authority to override individual moral judgment. Soviet soldiers who raped women weren't monsters from birth. They were ordinary men who had been systematically trained to dehumanize others and obey without question. NKVD officers who executed intellectuals weren't sadists. They were bureaucrats following procedures in a system where questioning orders meant your own execution. And Allied leaders who suppressed evidence of Soviet crimes weren't evil. They were pragmatists, making calculated decisions in a world where absolute moral clarity was a luxury they couldn't afford. This is the terrifying truth about human psychology. Under the right conditions, with the right structures in place, ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil. Not because they're inherently bad, but because the psychological and social mechanisms that normally constrain behavior are systematically dismantled. And the most disturbing part? Those same mechanisms still exist today. Dehumanization of outgroups, authoritarian control of information, punishment of dissent, collective moral disengagement in service of a greater good. The tools that enabled Soviet atrocities during World War II
aren't relics of history. They're patterns of human behavior that emerge whenever power becomes absolute and truth becomes flexible. The question isn't whether this could happen again. It's happening right now, in different forms, in different places, to different people. And most people won't believe it, just like they didn't believe it in 1945, because believing it would require confronting something deeply uncomfortable about human nature and about the institutions we trust to tell us the truth. You probably won't fight in a war, but you will live in societies where truth is negotiated, where narratives are controlled, where inconvenient facts are buried.
And when you see information being suppressed, when you hear official stories that seem too simple, when witnesses are dismissed and documents remain classified, remember what you learned here. Remember that the Soviet Union committed mass atrocities while the world called them heroes. Not because people were stupid, but because truth is always the first casualty when power and propaganda align. The uncomfortable reality is that we don't get the truth we deserve. We get the truth that serves power, unless we're willing to dig for it, to question it, to demand it, even when it's politically inconvenient. That's the lesson Russia doesn't want you to learn. That's the truth that remained hidden for 50 years. Not just what the Soviet Union did, but how easily the world looked away. If you want to keep descending into the depths where real history lives, where the narratives crack and the uncomfortable truths emerge, subscribe now. Because this is what they don't teach you in school. This is what gets edited out of documentaries. This is what makes people uncomfortable at dinner parties. But it's the truth. And understanding it changes everything about how you see power, propaganda, and human nature itself. The question is, are you willing to keep looking?